Good evening, everybody. My name is Peter Smyth. I work for Jacobs Engineering, and my short presentation this evening is why do our properties flood? So as engineers, we get asked to solve problems. It's what we're trained to do, and it's what we're badly paid to do as well, unfortunately. Well, one such problem that's blighting communities up and down Ireland is flooding. You can see here on the screen, these are images from flood events that have happened over the last 10 years, from Cork in 2008, Belfast 2007, right the way through to Fermanagh 2016, and even in Donegal recently in 2017. Well, what are we going to do about it? Well, as engineers, as well as looking at the problems, we have to go right the way back and see, well, what's causing that problem? And we have to look at the why. Knocking that down there. So that's what this presentation is about, is looking at the why. Why do our properties flood? Well, there are some potential reasons. First one there would be climate change. I can feel some questions coming from the floor later on about this, but one of them is possibly climate change. Second one, rivers can't cope with the flow. What about the lack of investment in flood defences? There's a loss of green field as a possible option, or change in farming practices. Well, the reality is all of those have some degree of impact on it, but it's not the biggest impact. Well, if I did have a prop, I'd go over here and give a bit of a drum roll, but I didn't bring that with us. So the one thing that has the biggest impact on why our properties flood is very simply that we're building our houses in the wrong place. Poor planning decisions. Now, the image here on the top corner here is a village in County Leitrim. The blue line here is actually the original route of the River Shannon. Now, everybody knows the River Shannon is big flows, big catchment, high levels, large floodplain. Yet this area here was built on. You've got houses there, you've got communities, you've got roads, you've got churches, you've got hospitals. You have to ask yourself why. Why is that built? And similarly down the bottom here in County Clare, beautiful coastal village, lovely views from these particular front row houses here, but they flood every single year. Every year the sea rises and floods those particular properties. Now, there's a bit of a takeaway moment here. As I get my red card there, I want this to take away with you, is we're actually not going to engineer a way out of this. There isn't a solution to it. We're not going to prevent flooding. What we have to do is we have to look at ways of engineers of adapting it. So we can build defences. This particular area down here, we can build defences around the house. But all that's going to do is reduce the risk of that particular house flooding. Or we could put houses on stilts, as we have in the top image there, and that would allow the house to adapt. So we're adapting to flooding, but we're not going to prevent the flooding. So the takeaway from tonight is that sometimes in engineering, the best solution is not to build. If we want to have properties that don't flood, if we want to protect our communities, the thing we have to do is to not build in the floodplains. And that's me.
Peter Smyth, ladies and gentlemen. The time was 190 seconds.
Okay, thanks, Peter. So I'm totally with you. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. Mm-hmm. So why, and we know that, are we not able to influence the planning decisions? We are the experts. So how do we do that?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, it's by legislation as well. I mean, legislation has changed. I think, although I talked about climate change there, I mean, I think what isn't really well known is between the sort of 1960s right the way through until the 2000s, we were actually in a relatively dry period. You know, if you look at the graphs over 100 years, 200 years, over that period of time, there wasn't a huge amount of rainfall over that period, relatively speaking. It was a relatively dry period. Now, what that meant is a lot of building took place over that period of time. So we probably took our eye off the ball. We probably lost focus on risk, on what the risk of flooding was. It's only really been since 1990 onwards we've started to see more flooding, more regular flooding, higher flooding, and properties have started to flood and flooded in areas that were previously developed on. But the legislation has caught up. You know, planning regulation now, both in the north and the south and UK, is a lot stricter. It's harder to build in the floodplains now. There's a lot more awareness. Rivers Agency up here and the OPW in the south spent a lot of money mapping rivers. So there's a lot more visibility about the areas that are at risk, and the legislation's in place now to protect it. So it still can happen, and there are still communities that are built in it. But I think the awareness of legislation has certainly caught up.
Those properties that you showed, particularly in County Clare, were they recently built?
The one, actually, that one there was the one there in Leitrim. They were probably built in the 80s, and probably built on from that. But the thing that strikes me, that you don't have to be a scientist to realise you're, 200 metres from the River Shannon. So I don't know how that's happened.
Something primitive about us. That's when we used to build our early settlements down beside the river
That's
because
right, yeah.
of access. Yeah. And maybe we've just lost the run of ourselves a bit. I'm hanging over tomorrow.
Would you take it to the next level, Peter, and say that where houses are built where they shouldn't be, they should be knocked down and put somewhere else?
Well, I'm not going to say that, but I mean, I think it's we do manage retreat, so that's something that is being looked at, and it does happen in parts of the UK as well, where they used to abandon areas. Parts of the Shannon as well. We did a big study on River Shannon, and there's new legislation being brought in down south as well, where they will relocate. The government will pay for it if because houses that are in the floodplain can't get insurance, they're worthless. The areas are blighted. So the Irish government is looking into ways of actually relocating communities from these blighted areas and moving them elsewhere. But it's political, and there's a lot of money that's needed. But I wouldn't rule it out, Mark. No.
I'm not going to be quite as extreme as that, but I think this is probably, or it seems to be, a growing problem, and we have a growing population. And like you were saying, I think people just want to live near water. It's beautiful, and there's something about our culture that calls for that. And are we looking into ways to soak up this water with design rather than location?
Big sponge. So what do you mean, like a big massive sponge? There's a PhD in that somewhere, is there? I think realistically, with taking on board climate change and the increased probability of risk and the higher volumes of river flow and that, I think we've got to learn to adapt. I think we've got to learn to either live with it or adapt to it. So even though I give the example there of the house on stilts, if you want to have a nice view of the river, you've got to have to accept that you're going to have some inconvenience. If that means living on stilts, then so be it. So I think it's probably adapting is probably the solution rather than trying to soak it up, to be honest.
Any questions from the audience?
Anyone? Yep.
I currently I'm under the assumption that there's a 1 in 100 flood event that the building is controlled by, building planning permission is controlled by. The local residents at the Conswater Greenway were most incensed that this didn't appear to be anything like adequate as a parameter, and it was changed, I believe, to a 1 in 100 flood event, thereby creating another order of safety. Would you be aware that if the 1 in 100 is still the given standard?
Well, 1 in 100 is a probability. It's a probability of an event happening. So you get 100-sided dice. You roll it. The probability of that one side coming up is the probability of that event happening. So the legislation is the 1%, or the 1 in 100, and that's the standard that is expected for most flood defences, both in UK and the south. So yeah, the 1 in 100 is the given. Now in coastal areas, that actually goes up to 1 in 200. And the thing to bear in mind is that a 1 in 100 is as it stands at the minute. But if we were then to fast forward 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, that probability would actually, the actual 1 in 100 would stay the same as the probability, but the actual volume of flow that would constitute that could increase. So it's important, take the Greenway, for example, which is a relatively successful scheme. It is built into it, adaptability. So the Greenway itself could actually be raised in the future to account for changes in flow, changes for the increase because of climate change and that change in probability of occurrence. That was a good question.
Perhaps we could look at the situation about the floodplain And in the floodplain, inevitably there will be farmers who have farmed that land and lived there. So you did mention, and perhaps quickly dismissed, the notion of alternative farming or agricultural practices. Do you think there's any mileage in looking at that again and taking the notion of the sponge and capturing the water and reducing the release?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I did quickly brush over that. We're at 200 seconds up here, so you're moving at pace. But yeah, like farming practices in terms of farmers taking away hedges, in terms of farmers clearing out their ditches, in terms of farmers aggressively sowing their land and cutting it and such like, that does impact on the sponge effect. So, you know, the same plot of land with the rainfall that fell on it 100 years ago compared to now, it gets into the water course, which ultimately gets in the river a lot quicker. So I don't think it's a solution, but I agree with you that there are ways that we can manage our catchment better to hold the flow back. And that is part of the solution. You know, as I think, I'll come back to the final point there, that we're not engineering our way out of this. I mean, I think that is part of it. You know, that what you're talking about there is part of the solution. Building defences is not the solution. We have to learn of more sustainable ways. We have to learn the ways to adapt, and work in the catchment is undoubtedly going to help with that.
Tell everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, our final speaker, Peter Smyth.